Whether you travel north, south, east or west, the British landscape is as varied as it is lovely, and for the great authors of English literature, the countryside has always provided a rich tapestry of inspiration. From the Kent of Charles Dickens to the Hampshire of Jane Austen, there's always somewhere fascinating to visit. And with D.H. Lawrence's Nottinghamshire, George Eliot's Warwickshire, and Thomas Hardy's Wessex, there's no shortage of locations. But when it comes to wild, dramatic moors, it has to be the Brontes' Yorkshire. I'm Liam Dale, and I'd be delighted to show you around.
I promised you wild, and I think you'll agree this landscape is certainly that, and a great deal more besides. This is Haworth Moor, and if I tell you that this is where Charlotte, Emily and Anne Bronte, along with their brother Branwell, played as children, you'll instantly recognise where the inspiration for such dark, brooding, romantic classics as Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall came from. But wonderful as these great novels might be, the story of the three sisters is equally as fascinating, and if we take the path across the moor to the town of Haworth and the parsonage at the top of the hill where the Brontes lived, you can see for yourself how this tragic and turbulent tale unfolds. By the time the girls moved to Haworth, when their father, the Reverend Patrick Bronte, was appointed the perpetual curate of St. Michael and All Angels, the family was definitely prospering. And you may be surprised to learn that there were two older sisters, Maria and Elizabeth, as well as our future authors.
Maria had just turned 6. Elizabeth was 5. Charlotte, brother Branwell and Emily had been born in consecutive years, followed by Anne, who was just a few weeks old when the Brontes arrived here in February 1820. As Mrs. Bronte was kept busy with her brood of 6 children, her husband settled into his new parish, and his parishioners would have quickly realised that their new vicar was quite a unique character. Born into poverty in Ireland, young Patrick Bronte, as the family were known, was determined to make his way in the world, despite being one of 10 children. He was a clever boy and quickly realised that education was the best way to achieve his ambitions. Even so, being accepted at Cambridge to study at St. John's College was remarkable, and as well as taking up a promising career in the church, Patrick also had aspirations to become a published author. He was actually quite an accomplished poet, and no doubt believed that changing his surname to the grander-sounding Bronte might help him progress. When his studies were complete, Patrick served as a curate, first in Essex and then Shropshire, before moving to Yorkshire.
After a brief stay at Dewsbury, Patrick Bronte came here to Hartshead in 1811. It was an interesting time. Hartshead was at the epicentre of the Luddite protests. Many of Patrick's parishioners were part of the movement, rebelling violently against industrial progress. The threat to the mill owners in the area from workers who'd been laid off as a result of new machinery was deadly, and even the Reverend Bronte found it sensible to keep a loaded pistol to hand at all times.
In later years, the Bronte children would be fascinated by their father's tales of the Luddites, and Charlotte would actually use Patrick's reminiscences to form the plot of her novel, Shirley. As the troubles subsided and peace was restored, Patrick found himself well respected and settled in the parish, and at the age of 35 turned his thoughts to marriage. When he met the lively Cornish-born Maria Branwell, the niece of an old friend, romance soon blossomed, and the happy couple were married in 1812. The family quickly grew with the births of daughters Maria and Elizabeth, but the ambitious Patrick, after 4 years, was ready to advance his career and was appointed as perpetual curate at Thornton Church, a short distance away. The church may not have been the prettiest, nor the accommodation provided for the Bronte family the grandest, but they soon settled happily into their new parish. If you take a closer look at the house they lived in, 74 Market Street, you'll see that there were 4 new additions to the family in quick succession. Charlotte was born in 1816, Brother Branwell in 1817, Emily in 1818, and finally Anne in 1820. These were happy days. Patrick even enjoyed some local literary success with his poetry and prose, while his wife relished a delightfully busy social life amongst her friends and neighbours. But this was far from being a large house, and with 6 growing children, not to mention a couple of servants, it wasn't long before the Reverend Bronte, ambitious as ever, was looking around for a bigger parish, an increased stipend, and a more appropriate property to cater for his domestic arrangements. So when the living at Haworth, just 5 miles away, became vacant, complete with its large Georgian parsonage backing onto the moors, it was time to exchange the cosy comforts of Thornton for the wild landscape that would inspire such great literary creations.
What a pleasure it must have been for the Bronte family to arrive here, although as for us today, in January 1820, it might well have been a tad chilly. But it's immediately evident that this substantial property was built to withstand whatever the weather threw its way. Getting on for 200 years later, what is now the Bronte Parsonage Museum is as welcoming as ever for visitors from all over the world.
With so much hope for a bright future, Patrick Bronte had come a very long way from the poverty of his birth in Ireland. But within the briefest space of time, this fleeting joy would turn to sorrow and utter despair. Mrs. Bronte fell ill soon after moving into the parsonage, and it was a terrible blow for Patrick. Already weak after the birth of her 6th child in as many years, Maria was confined to bed. Despite her husband's tireless efforts researching cures and looking for medicine, nothing could combat the cancer that had taken such a speedy but secure hold. Then, when all of the children were struck down with what was then the deadly scarlet fever, Patrick's tenure at Haworth that had started with such promise seemed blighted as he faced losing his entire family.
Fortunately, Mrs. Bronte's sister, Elizabeth Branwell, came to the rescue, arriving from Cornwall to take charge of the household, and soon the children had all been restored to health. But their mother, after suffering horribly, lost her battle for life on the 15th of September, 1821.
She was heard to cry out,
"Oh God, my poor children."
And the sight of Mrs. Bronte's coffin being carried through this narrow gate to her final resting place in the family vault in the church must have been devastating to witness.
Distraught, the Reverend Bronte shut himself away from everyone in his grief, becoming stern with the children who were, by all accounts, grave and silent beyond their years. Elizabeth Branwell, a strict Methodist, considered it her duty to care for her sister's children, so she remained at the parsonage.
Gradually, order was restored, and the children turned to each other as they played together out on the moors, where they would not disturb their father. One of the family servants described the touching scene.
The 6 little creatures used to walk out hand in hand towards the glorious wild moors, which in after days they loved so passionately.
Life did go on, but sadly for the Brontes of Haworth, worse was yet to come. Education had been the making of Patrick Bronte, and when he found a school for clergymen's daughters advertised, the two older girls were quickly dispatched, with Charlotte and Emily following a few weeks later. All that remains of the school at Cowan Bridge, about 50 miles from the parsonage, is a row of cottages that made up part of the establishment. And as delightful as the setting looks today, all was far from well back in the winter of 1825. The school had been started by a well-intentioned clergyman who'd been horrified by the number of weddings he presided over, where the bride could only make a mark in the register because she was unable to read or write. But sadly, the establishment was beset with difficulties, and it wasn't long before catastrophe struck.
The first the Reverend Bronte knew of the tragedy about to unfold was when news came that Maria had fallen ill. Conditions were bleak at the school, and in the cold and damp, Patrick's eldest daughter had contracted tuberculosis.
A typhus epidemic had also broken out, an episode that Charlotte would recall vividly in her novel Jane Eyre. But by the time Maria reached Haworth, it was too late. She died on the 6th of May 1825 at the age of 11 and was buried with her mother in the family vault.
Then news came that Elizabeth was also suffering from TB, and when she reached Haworth, obviously very sick indeed, Charlotte and Emily were immediately brought back to the parsonage too. And if you want to know what happens to the girls, all will be revealed in just a few moments. Thankfully, the news wasn't all bad. Charlotte and Emily, as you know, survived to tell the tale, but sadly Elizabeth, just 2 weeks after returning to Haworth, followed her sister and mother to the Bronte vault. She was 10 years old.
For the time being, Patrick Bronte kept his surviving children with him, but continued as withdrawn and stern as ever. Charlotte, Emily and Anne, along with their brother Branwell, became extremely close, and out on the moors they started to write imaginary tales.
When Patrick Bronte gave his son a box of toy soldiers, he really started something, as the children made them into the heroes of their stories, creating imaginary lands out here, far away from their father's disapproving gaze. The Reverend Bronte was already suffering from deteriorating eyesight, and the creative children wrote everything down in the tiniest of books, preventing him from seeing what they were up to. And even at this early stage, their talent was emerging.
But childhood and the freedom to roam could not last forever, and with no family fortune, all four of them would have to make their way in the world. For the girls, this would mean working as teachers or governesses, and this required further education. At the age of 15, Charlotte was sent to Roe Head School, and although homesick, she did well there, and with her studies complete, she returned as a teacher, taking Emily with her.
For Emily, though, the homesickness was too much, and after 3 months, as concerns for her health grew, she was allowed to return to Haworth while Anne took her place. The youngest Bronte sister had a far more placid nature than the wild, passionate Emily, and she accepted her life at Roe Head with Charlotte. However, Branwell, as the only boy, was allowed to chase his dream of becoming an artist. With what money could be scraped together, he set himself up as a portrait painter in Bradford. But with no training and limited talent, he failed miserably. Branwell had squandered his family's investment in him and turned to drink to drown his sorrows.
Fortunately, it was the age of steam, and as the tracks were fast cut across the Pennine landscape, Branwell found employment working for the railway. While Patrick continued to minister to the people of Haworth, all three of his daughters found positions as governesses, an experience that Anne would use for inspiration in her novel, Agnes Grey. However, Emily struggled again, and after 6 months returned to the parsonage, claiming she preferred the dogs to her pupils.
It's interesting to note that here in the church there's a monument to William Waitman, who became Patrick's curate at about this time. The handsome young man sent a Valentine's card to the sisters in 1840, and although it seems that gentle Anne was his choice, there was a tragic end to the romance. As cholera was rife in Haworth, he contracted the disease and died in 1842. The death rate in Haworth was incredibly high at the time, the reason being that these flat gravestones lying horizontally at the top of the steep hill allowed contamination from the bodies below to seep into the water supply for the whole town.
When this was discovered, the practice was stopped, but as you can see from these upright gravestones in this very crowded burial ground, for many it was too late.
For the Brontes, these were dark days. We've come to the Black Bull on Haworth's cobbled High Street, which is where Branwell Bronte could all too often be found. He'd been dismissed from the railway for constant and culpable carelessness, and again turned to drink for solace. And it wasn't just alcohol that Branwell took to excess, as he also bought opium from the apothecary across the road, as he spiralled towards addiction and even more erratic behaviour. The sisters by now realised that their brother was not just a lost cause, but also an added burden as they struggled to improve the family finances. As time passed, though, the answer to their prayers took shape on their own doorstep, and plans for the Bronte sisters to open their own school here in Haworth took shape. Aunt Branwell offered to help finance the project, but the girls also needed to offer a varied curriculum, including modern languages. So Charlotte and Emily set off for Belgium to attend a boarding school in Brussels.
The stay was shortened as Aunt Branwell fell ill, but died before the girls reached Haworth, and the ever-homesick Emily remained to keep house for Patrick while Charlotte returned to Belgium. She was totally besotted with Monsieur Hager, the school's head, but her passion was unrequited. What's more, his wife took a very dim view of the young English girl pursuing her husband, and Charlotte's second visit was also cut short.
Even so, the girls were now equipped to open their own school, and they advertised accordingly. But they failed to attract a single pupil, leaving Charlotte to come up with an alternative strategy to generate an income.
All three of the sisters had written poetry, and although it took all Charlotte's powers of persuasion to get Emily to agree, they presented their work for publication under the male pseudonyms Currer Ellis and Acton Bell. Few copies were sold, but it was the beginning of the Brontes' literary career, and as Charlotte accompanied her father to have eye surgery, which required weeks spent in a darkened room, she started work on Jane Eyre. It was her second novel, as she'd already written The Professor, based on her experiences in Belgium, which had been turned down by various publishers, but Jane Eyre was taken immediately by Smith, Elder & Co.
Emily, meanwhile, had been working on a novel too, the wild and passionate Wuthering Heights, with Heathcliff and Cathy falling in love against the dramatic backdrop of the moors. It's believed by many that she based Wuthering Heights on Top Withins, once a solitary farmhouse that would have suited Heathcliff perfectly.
Anne had also been busy writing Agnes Grey, and along with Emily's Wuthering Heights, it was published by Thomas Newby. Despite neither story selling as well as Jane Eyre, interest was growing in the identities of Currer Acton and Ellis Bell. Then, when Newby tried to pass off Anne's dark and brooding The Tenant of Wildfell Hall as by the author of Jane Eyre, Charlotte decided that it was high time to reveal the Bronte sisters, which was done on a visit to Smith Elder & Co. in London.
However, the success of Charlotte, Emily and Anne was of little consolation to Branwell, who spent much of his time in this very chair, in a drunken stupor. Often the Reverend Bronte was called to remove his son from the Black Bull, and eventually the young man fell victim to tuberculosis, and back at the parsonage, his days were numbered.
Branwell died on September the 24th, 1848, but the tragic consequences of this highly contagious disease were much farther reaching.
While Charlotte was still grieving for her brother, she realised that Emily and Anne were both showing the telltale symptoms of TB. Emily refused all medical help until it was too late. She died just days before Christmas at the age of 30.
As the new year progressed, Anne's condition worsened, and Charlotte took her to Scarborough in the hope that the bracing sea air would help. But it was of little use. Anne died in Scarborough and is the only member of the family not buried in the vault at Haworth.
With only Patrick and Charlotte left at Haworth, these were dark days, but eventually Charlotte turned to her writing for comfort, completing Shirley, a novel inspired by her father's Heart's tales of the Luddites.
Then Charlotte returned to Memories of Belgium to write Villette, and she was by now something of a celebrity. However, there was disquiet at the parsonage between father and daughter, because Patrick Bronte's curate, Arthur Bell Nichols, proposed marriage to the now famous author. Patrick refused to give his permission, and Charlotte turned Arthur down, but eventually she agreed, and on condition that the newlyweds remained at the parsonage, the Reverend Bronte finally gave his consent, and they married in 1854. There was to be no happy ending, though. Charlotte fell ill, possibly in the early stages of pregnancy, and sadly by now you can probably guess the outcome. Patrick Bronte's last surviving child died on the 31st of March 1855, leaving him to live out his days here at Haworth with only the widowed Nichols for company.
Nevertheless, the fact that I'm standing here today, where thousands of visitors come from all over the world to find Bronte country, means that the legacy of these truly remarkable writers lives on. So it's only right that we should leave the last word to the ladies, with Emily's beautiful poem summing up the very essence of this unforgettable place.
There is a spot mid barren hills where winter howls and driving rain. But if the dreary tempest chills, there is a light that warms again. The house is old, the trees are bare, and moonless bends the misty dome. But what on earth is half so dear, so longed for, as the hearth of home?
Wherever you find yourself in rural Britain, you can be pretty sure that some novelist or other will have passed by at some stage in the nation's history and immortalised the view as the published word. It could be Jane Austen's Hampshire Hamlets, Charles Dickens' Kent Coast, the Bronte sisters' Yorkshire Dales, D.H.LAWRENCE's Nottinghamshire Landscapes, or George Eliot's picturesque Warwickshire. But on this occasion, it's the green and pleasant countryside of Dorset that we'll be focusing on. I'm Liam Dale, and I'd like to welcome you to Thomas Hardy's Wessex.
For anyone in search of the most perfect example of an English country cottage, Thomas Hardy's birthplace would have to be a major contender in the delightful setting of Higher Bockhampton on the outskirts of Dorchester. It was here on the 2nd of June 1840 that Thomas Hardy made his entry into the world, and you only have to look around you to see where so much of his inspiration for the beautiful evocative descriptions of rural life that fill his novels came from. But this is not where our author's story actually begins, and if we travel the short distance to the nearby village of Stinsford, you can see where it all started. Welcome to St Michael's Church, where Jemima Hand, a young maid at Stinsford House, first laid eyes on a musician by the name of Thomas Hardy, who came with his father and uncle to play the violin for the Sunday service. With no organ in many country churches, this was quite a common practice.
Despite Jemima's aspirations to better herself, being a keen reader, romance blossomed between the musician and the servant girl. And like many a fair maid in Hardy's later novels, she found herself pregnant. Fortunately for Jemima, the young man was prevailed upon to do the honourable thing, and the couple were married just a few days before Christmas 1839 and moved to the Hardy family cottage at Higher Bockhampton.
The Hardys were actually builders by trade, and the cottage had been constructed in the early 1800s from whatever resources could be found. By the time Jemima arrived, the family was presided over by her mother-in-law, Mary Hardy, who would pass on her tales of old country folklore to her grandson.
However thwarted Jemima might have felt by her necessary marriage, Thomas Hardy Sr. proved to be a good husband, and a year after the birth of her son, also named Thomas, a daughter, Mary, was born. Ironically, Jemima would warn all of her children never to marry, but she soon turned her attention to ensuring that her new son had every opportunity to better himself through education. As life for the Hardys settled, the frail Tommy, as our author was known, proved to be as intelligent as he was sensitive. Forever losing himself in books, he also developed a keen love of nature and his beautiful surroundings, and when he was 8 years old, he was sent to school in Lower Bockhampton, which is to this day the epitome of a classic English village. Young Thomas Hardy was captivated by the lady of the manor, who opened the school shortly before his arrival. In fact, he was one of her first pupils. But it was quickly evident that this excellent student was ready to progress beyond what this rural establishment could offer. Consequently, he was sent to Dorchester at the age of 10 to continue his studies. And during his 3-mile walk to school, he would cross the stone-arched bridge into the town, leaving the countryside behind as he encountered independence for the first time and the hustle and bustle of urban rather than rural life. Thomas stayed at school until he was 16, by which time the family had increased with the birth of Henry in 1851 and another daughter, Kate. Mr. and Mrs. Hardy were nonetheless determined to encourage their eldest son to aspire to greatness, and instead of him entering the family building business, he was apprenticed to the Dorchester architects Hicks in South Street, taking his first steps towards professional advancement. Thomas Hardy again excelled, becoming a meticulous draftsman at a time when architects were much in demand, as wealthy Victorians made ostentatious additions to their properties. He also found himself called upon to work on the restoration of the fabric of various churches, but as his sharp mind continued to develop, Thomas Hardy began to question the religious doctrine that was preached within.
Visitors to Stinsford are delighted to discover the Thomas Hardy Memorial Window, which depicts the author's favourite passage of Scripture from the Old Testament, when the prophet Elijah hears the still small voice of God. However, it was within this very church that the vicar's sermon so incensed young Hardy one Sunday morning that he turned away not only from Stinsford, but also from the Christian faith. The vicar had attacked the lower classes for aspiring to join the professions, just as our author had done, and this caused great offence.
Thomas Hardy, for a while, attended other churches, but with bold new ideas circulating, pioneered by Charles Darwin and his theories of natural selection and the origin of the species, the cracks in Hardy's faith began to widen. Also, after 6 years studying architecture in Dorchester, Hardy looked to broaden his horizons in terms of his career, leaving the county town and the pastoral landscape of Dorset far behind him as he made his way to London in the hope of making his mark on the great city. With a thirst for knowledge, Hardy visited museums and art galleries, went to the theatre, the opera, and even saw the acclaimed novelist Charles Dickens giving a public reading of his works. Being an able architect, he soon found work in Blomfield's offices just off Trafalgar Square. But seeing the contrast between the rich and the poor so dramatically demonstrated on the streets of London, he began to question the validity of his chosen profession. His attention turned to literature, and he began to write poetry, but failed miserably when it came to finding a publisher, and he felt that his lack of a university education and his lower-class background had held him back. Disappointed, Hardy's health also began to suffer, and in 1867 he decided to return to the peace and tranquillity of Dorset. It didn't take long for Hardy's health to be restored, and he came back to work at Hicks. Yet his London experiences had triggered his imagination, and Hardy started to look towards making his living writing novels as an alternative to architecture. At first he failed again to find a publisher, with his manuscript of Poor Man and a Lady rejected for being too hostile to the upper classes. Undeterred, he began to pen Desperate Remedies, the story of a lady's maid embroiled in a twisting plot of deception. And then fate took a hand in the life of Thomas Hardy when his architectural duties took him to the church of St. Juliet in Cornwall. When the door of the parsonage was opened by Emma Gifford, the rector's sister-in-law, Hardy looked into the eyes of the girl who would capture his heart. In the wild Cornish landscape, enjoying Emma's company and watching her ride, Hardy was both besotted and inspired. Oh, the opal and the sapphire of that wandering western sea, and the woman riding high above with bright hair flapping free, the woman whom I loved so, and who loyally loved me.
When the time came for Hardy to leave St. Juliet's, he returned to Higher Bockhampton, and with thoughts of Emma to motivate him, the young author managed to publish Desperate Remedies and began work on Under the Greenwood Tree.
There is no doubt that this description of the Dewey's cottage was based upon Hardy's own home. It was a long, low cottage with a hipped roof of thatch, having dormer windows breaking up into the eaves, a chimney standing in the middle of the ridge, and another at each end. The plot is also very telling, with the church of Mellstock so evidently based on Stinsford at the heart of the tale. Mellstock Choir and its musical players are to be replaced by an organ, and this storyline combined with that of Dick Dewey, one of the musicians infatuated with the lovely schoolmistress, are interwoven very deftly with Hardy's own memories of rural life. It was exactly to the taste of the Victorian reading public, and when it was published in 1872, it was a great success. Hardy's thoughts at this time were focused on Emma, so his next work, actually commissioned by his publisher and called A Pair of Blue Eyes, was based on his Cornish romance.
At this point in his life, Hardy was 32 years of age. His literary success meant that he could now turn his back on architecture to pursue his writing. What's more, the financial rewards meant that he was now in a position to ask for Emma's hand in marriage, something he wasted no time in doing. But if you want to know whether the love of Hardy's life said "I do," you'll need to join me again in just a few moments. Sadly, the path of true love failed to run smoothly, and when Thomas Hardy asked Emma's father's permission to marry his daughter, his request was turned down. Again, Hardy's lack of social position had hindered him, but ironically, back here at Higher Bockhampton, his own mother was equally opposed to the match.
Nevertheless, Emma and Hardy remained true to each other, and as our author started work on Far from the Madding Crowd, Emma became the inspiration for the vibrantly drawn Bathsheba Everdeen. When the novel was published in 1874, once again readers were delighted by Hardy's portrayal of rural life, and the dramatic events of this tale, complete with a suitably happy ending, made it another great success. On a more personal level too, Hardy was a happy man, as he and Emma married on September the 17th, 1874, despite neither of their families giving their blessings to the match. After sweeping Emma away for a honeymoon in Paris, the newlyweds first settled on the outskirts of London, but as ever Dorset pulled at Hardy's heartstrings, and they soon moved to Swanage. But despite the wonderful sea views, the sparkle of the Hardys' romance was beginning to lose its lustre. The wild, free-spirited girl from Cornwall was somehow dulled by domesticity in her husband's eyes, and his next novel, Ethelberta's Hand, telling the story of a servant's child trying to rise above their station, did not meet with Emma's approval. Over an unsettled period, the Hardys moved a number of times, but eventually they relocated to Sturminster Newton, and life for both Thomas and Emma began to improve.
And is it any wonder, here at Riverside Villa, with its wonderful views of the Dorset countryside, Hardy would take Emma on boat trips on the River Stour, and it was as if the first flush of their romance was rekindled.
In this happy state, Hardy began work on The Return of the Native, drawing his inspiration from childhood memories of walking with his mother to visit his Aunt Maria across the heath. His descriptions of Dorset are at their most atmospheric and define the genius of Thomas Hardy with true eloquence. Even Hardy talked of this time with Emma as being a 2-year idyll, but just as his characters in The Return of the Native failed to live happily ever after, a shadow had fallen across his marriage, as the hoped-for conception of a child eluded the Hardys. Thomas became restless, and needing to research his next novel, The Trumpet Major, a move to London was decided upon, but this did little to improve matters between husband and wife. After 3 years in London, the call of Dorset again pulled Thomas Hardy homeward, and it was to a plot of land on the outskirts of Dorchester that this particular native returned.
You see before you Maxgate, the house that Hardy used his architectural skill to design and his family building connections to construct, where he would live for the rest of his life.
Inspired by the close proximity of Dorchester, Hardy began to write The Mayor of Casterbridge, but a newspaper article giving an account of a man selling his wife also gave our author food for thought and underpins the plot of this remarkable novel. If you wander around Dorchester, Hardy's Casterbridge, you'll find many of the locations, including the house of Michael Henchard, the eponymous mayor, which is now a bank. In his story, Henchard sells his wife Susan and his baby daughter to a sailor, but when they return to find him years later, Hardy reunites them at an amphitheatre from Dorchester's Roman past, known as the Maumbury Rings. In the end, Henchard pays for his misdeeds, dying alone, a broken and bitterly disappointed man. And it would seem that his creator was also feeling somewhat depressed at this time, if these words from a letter to a friend are anything to go by. You would be quite shocked if I were to tell you how many weeks and months in bygone years I have gone to bed, wishing never to see daylight again.
No doubt Hardy's troubled marriage contributed to his sadness, but as at the time he planted a veritable forest of trees around Maxgate, he started work on the Woodlanders, while Emma became even more isolated.
Even so, the literary world did offer its compensations. The Hardys would always head to London to do the season, as the author had become something of a celebrity. Also, there were happier moments back at Maxgate, when Hardy and Emma rode around Dorset on their bicycles. And when they travelled abroad, they fulfilled Hardy's dream of visiting Rome to follow in the footsteps of the poets Shelley and Keats. As well as finding the house where Keats died at the foot of the Spanish Steps, the Hardys were overcome by the drama of the Forum on Palatine Hill, and when they returned home, our author was ready to tell the whole world his views on what he perceived as the injustices of Victorian society.
From his study at Maxgate, Hardy set to work on Tess of the d'Urbervilles, tackling such taboo subjects as rape, illegitimacy and the exploitation of the poor by the upper classes. Now, when it was published in 1891, the plight of country girl Tess was viewed as outrageous, with the novel branded as scandalous. But this did nothing to discourage sales, making Hardy, rather ironically, wealthier than ever, while the rifts in his marriage grew deeper.
If Tess of the d'Urbervilles scandalised Victorian society, what followed would shock them even more. When Jude the Obscure, the story of a disappointed village stonemason, was published, there was a public outcry, and members of the clergy actually burnt the book as a protest over its subject matter. When Jude's young son hangs first his brother and sister, and then himself, leaving a note saying, "Done because we are too many," people were horrified. Hardy was dismayed by the strength of feeling against him, and in fact, he slipped back into depression, and from this time onwards poured all his creativity into his poetry, never writing another novel.
On the domestic front at Maxgate, the novel was equally problematic, because Emma had developed an evangelical fervour and was horrified at what her husband had written. Handing Hardy a Bible, she promptly moved out of the marital bedroom and into the attic, which became her sanctuary.
With the dawn of the 20th century, a new age dawned, and with the death of Queen Victoria in 1901, the world that Thomas Hardy had rebelled against began to change. As Hardy continued to publish wonderful poems, his novels became even more popular with a more liberated readership, and fans travelled to Dorset to see the dramatic locations immortalised in his great works. People wrote to Hardy from all over the world, and when a young teacher by the name of Florence Dugdale asked if she could visit him in 1905, a new chapter began for the now famous writer. A relationship developed between the unlikely pair, with Florence calling herself Hardy's secretary. But when the unhappy Emma died in 1912, Florence was keen to take her place. Emma Hardy was buried in Stinsford churchyard, Despite the difficulties experienced during 38 years of marriage, Hardy was overwhelmed by his memories, and the poems that followed commemorated the beautiful wild girl he had fallen in love with all those years earlier. Nevertheless, Thomas Hardy married Florence in the February of 1914 as the storm clouds of World War I gathered, and Hardy lived out his days at Maxgate, continuing to write his stunning poetry. It was only failing health that stopped him writing in the end, and after a month of illness, he died from a heart attack on the 11th of January 1928. And so we come full circle, back to Stinsford Church, where Jemima Hand first took a fancy to the musical Thomas Hardy Sr. all those years earlier.
But it's only the heart of our great author buried here in this grave. This is because his London friends believed Thomas Hardy should be buried in Westminster Abbey's Poets' Corner, and this is where the rest of his mortal remains were interred, alongside the great and the good of English literature.
As a final note, it's worth mentioning that you can distinguish between the graves of Thomas Hardy Sr. and Jr. by the letters OM after our author's name. King George V bestowed the Order of Merit on Thomas Hardy in 1910, and for a man who all his life felt at a disadvantage because of his poor rural background, he achieved great things, and ironically, it was his memories of the salt-of-the-earth farming folk and the simple joys of country life that made his rise to fame and fortune possible. The tradition of the great British novel is as popular today as it's ever been, and since the first novelists put quill to parchment, the beautiful rural landscape has proved to be a major source of inspiration. Whether that happens to be the Hampshire countryside of Jane Austen, the Kent of Charles Dickens, the wild Yorkshire moors of the Bronte sisters, the Nottinghamshire of D.H.LAWRENCE, or the ancient Wessex of Thomas Hardy, each location speaks volumes. I'm Liam Dale, and if you'd like to join me, I'd be delighted to introduce you to the Warwickshire of George Eliot.
As birthplaces go, I must say South Farm is one of the loveliest I've ever seen. And in the very heart of the Warwickshire countryside, you just couldn't ask for a more idyllic location. It was here, on the 22nd of November 1819, that Mary Ann Evans, perhaps the most successful novelist of her generation, was born. And if you're wondering why that name doesn't sound terribly familiar, it's probably because you know her much better by her nom de plume, George Eliot.
The reason for so little changing here since the author responsible for such classics as The Mill on the Floss, Silas Marner and Middlemarch was born is the fact that it's part of the Arbory estate, where traditional rural values are as respected today as they've ever been. South Farm by custom is the home of the estate manager, and back in 1819 the position and the house were in the possession of Mr. Robert Evans, George Eliot's father. Although the Evans family and their new addition were only at South Farm for about 4 months, Arbory was to have a huge impact on George Eliot, as Robert Evans continued to look after the estate for the Newdegate family. And if you'd like to come with me the short distance to Arbory Hall, you'll see for yourself why the big house made such a lasting impression.
Welcome to Arbory Hall, the ancestral home of Viscount and Viscountess Daventry, where George Eliot, thanks to her father's high-ranking position in this household, was permitted to use the extensive library. Now, even as a small girl, she was a voracious reader, and at the age of 7 was a fan of Sir Walter Scott's Waverley, not to mention the works of Bunyan, Defoe and Goldsmith.
Although the hall is Elizabethan in origin, building work in the 18th century transformed it into one of the finest examples of Gothic revival you're ever likely to see. And if we go inside, there are more Arbory treasures to reveal. One of the most striking features of this house has to be the soaring fan vaults with filigree tracery that must have been truly mesmerising for a small child. In one of George Eliot's less well-known works, Mr. Gilfil's Love Story, from Scenes of Clerical Life, she describes carved ceilings that looked like petrified lacework in a house called Cheverel Manor, and I'm sure you'll agree with me when I say that there can be no doubt where she took her inspiration from. Nevertheless, Mary Ann Evans had a very long way to go before she wrote this delightful tale. And to discover more about George Eliot's own fascinating story, it's time to head to a nearby hostelry, which just happens to have been an equally important source of inspiration for George Eliot the writer as Arbory Hall, being the house that the Evans family moved to when she was still a babe in arms all those years ago.
Now, when Robert Evans brought his family here to live at Griff House, needless to say, it wasn't a pub or even a hotel back then, and this is the place that George Eliot called home while she was growing up.
Robert Evans had 2 children by his first wife, who had died in 1809, and 2 with his second wife, Christina, before she gave birth to Mary Ann in 1819. The closest in age to our future author was her brother Isaac, who she adored, and the pair spent many happy hours together in the countryside around Griff House and on the Arbory estate. And although George Eliot would become a city dweller as an adult, she would never forget her rural roots, which are at the very heart of her greatest novels. In fact, in The Mill on the Floss, the characters of Maggie Tulliver and her brother Tom are without question autobiographical, with Tom always scolding Maggie for her wayward behaviour, something that Isaac would take to the extreme in later years.
We've now come right to the top of Griff House to discover a very special place, and I must confess to being really excited about being here. This attic, with its low beams, is the place where the burgeoning George Eliot loved best. It was her sanctuary. And when she describes young Maggie Tulliver fleeing to the attic when she's in trouble with Tom for not feeding his rabbits, again, just as at Arbory Hall, we're left in no doubt whatsoever as to where the inspiration came from. Maggie stood motionless, except from her sobs, for a minute or two. Then she turned round and ran into the house and up to her attic, where she sat on the floor and laid her head against the worm-eaten shelf with a crushing sense of memory. Tom was come home, and she had thought how happy she should be, and now he was cruel to her, What use was anything if Tom didn't love her? Oh, he was very cruel.
If you're thinking that Griff House looks nothing like a mill, you'd be quite correct, because we've come to a remarkable mill at Charlcote, also in Warwickshire, which is one of the few fully working traditional flour mills you'll find in Britain today.
George Eliot actually based the Dorlcote mill of her novel at St Ogg's in Lincolnshire. But to see what she actually had in mind today, reading her evocative words, I hope you'll agree Charlcote fits the bill perfectly. Maggie loved to linger in the great spaces of the mill, and often came out with her black hair powdered to a soft whiteness that made her dark eyes flash out with new fire. The resolute din, the unresting motion of the great stones, giving her a dim, delicious awe as at the presence of an uncontrollable force, the meal forever pouring, pouring. The fine white powder softening all surfaces and making the very spider nets look like fairy lacework. The sweet, pure scent of meal all helped to make Maggie feel that the mill was a little world apart from her outside everyday life.
The old country ways that have been so beautifully described in this novel paint a vivid picture of 19th century rural life, but there are those who view the work of George Eliot as rather serious. Yet her observations of the good country folk who would later become her cast of background characters add a wonderful touch of humour. Unlike her contemporary Charles Dickens, there's nothing sentimental in George Eliot's portrayal of either the people or the landscapes that inspired her. We do also get a glimpse of other members of her family through these characters, and again in The Mill on the Floss, when Mrs. Tulliver's sisters arrive, who we know are based on the sisters of Christina Evans, our author's aunts. The humour is evident. The well-to-do sisters are quick to voice their opinions, while deciding whether to buy teapots and table linen should there be a bankruptcy sale, as the Tullivers have fallen upon such hard times. Despite the tragic circumstances, their endearing bossiness is presented with wit and irony, as they gather at the mill to dispense advice when Mr. Tulliver is sick and the family face ruin, and Sister Glegg is determined to be heard.
It's for your own good I say this, for it's right you should feel what your state is, and what disgrace your husband's brought on your own family, as you've got to look for everything, and be humble in your mind. Mrs. Glegg paused, for speaking with much energy for the good of others is naturally exhausting.
For now, though, we'll leave the aunts at Charlcote Mill and return to Griff House to hear more about George Eliot's fascinating childhood. In The Mill on the Floss, Maggie is keen to be educated, but as was often the case in Victorian England, all the money was lavished on Tom as a boy, although Maggie is much brighter and would undoubtedly have made better use of the opportunity. However, this part of the tale is not autobiographical, because Mary Ann Evans received a very good education and excelled in her studies, until returning to Griff House at the age of 16 to help care for her dying mother. Mrs. Evans died in 1836 and is buried in the family tomb at nearby Chilvers Coton. The harrowing experience had a huge impact on Mary Ann. She developed an obsessive religious fervour, studying church history and even teaching herself Latin.
But other influences were about to transform this rather puritanical young lady into a passionate, worldly wise woman way ahead of her time. And if you want to know more, you'll have to join me again in just a few minutes. Robert Evans retired from his duties at Arbury Hall and as Isaac Evans was just about to marry, he remained at Griff House, keeping this lovely property in the family. Mary Ann and her father moved to nearby Coventry, and for Robert and Isaac, this was when the hitherto biddable Miss Evans started to become troublesome, flexing her intellectual muscle, having made new friends who were radical thinkers.
While Isaac remained the respectable countryman here at Griff, the reactionary Mary Ann turned her back on religion and began to follow where her heart and mind led her. When Robert Evans died in 1849, she actually asked,
"What shall I be without my father? It will seem as if part of my moral nature was gone."
And it wasn't long before Mary Ann's excellent education and early writing skills threw her into the path of temptation, as this evidently passionate, courageous young woman found her own way of coping with the restraints of Victorian society.
Actually, Robert Evans would have turned in his grave, well, to be more accurate, in the family tomb here at Chilvers Coton Churchyard, if he could have seen his daughter's headstrong ways. And even brother Isaac could do nothing to keep his sister in check once she'd moved to London.
This all came about because while she was still living in Coventry, she'd taken over a translation project for one of her radical friends who was struggling with the task. The work, Das Leben Jesu, ironically, the life of Christ, was indeed challenging and took Mary Ann 2 years to complete. However, although she remained anonymous, the publisher, John Chapman, was so delighted with the work he sought out its translator, and shortening her name to Marian, Miss Evans moved to Chapman's boarding house at 142 The Strand, where she began her literary career.
Although we can only speculate, it would seem that the dashingly handsome Chapman took more than a professional interest in his young lodger, and she apparently was not averse to his attentions. It was already an unusual household, and when Chapman's wife and his mistress, who also lived in the house, joined forces to have Marian removed, she was quite literally sent to Coventry, back home to Warwickshire.
The exile was short-lived though, as Chapman bought the Westminster Review, a journal for philosophical radicals, and Marian was promptly restored to her position in the house on the Strand to run the publication. Undaunted in her quest to find love, and at the very heart of literary society, Marian soon developed a relationship with Herbert Spencer, the editor of The Economist. Sadly for her, though, he described her as too morbidly intellectual to marry. Marian's infatuation with Spencer was only quelled when he introduced her to his friend George Henry Lewis, a fellow philosopher and writer. The pair quickly fell in love, and Spencer happily remained a confirmed bachelor for the rest of his days.
But there was a problem. George Lewis was married, albeit an unusual open relationship. His wife Agnes had given him 3 sons, but had also had further children with another man, who Lewis had given his name to, making a divorce all but impossible, as he'd been seen to condone his wife's infidelity. As a result, Marian also took the Lewis name, and the couple lived together as man and wife, but at a distance from even the more liberal-minded literary circle that they both moved in.
It was at this point that Marian, with the encouragement of Lewis, turned her attention to novel writing, choosing George Eliot as a masculine pen name, not only to court publishing success, but also perhaps to disguise her somewhat dubious marital status.
Nevertheless, it was not the elite intellectuals of London society that Marian turned to for inspiration. It was the beautiful Warwickshire countryside of her childhood. And if you come with me now to the lovely church of St. Mary the Virgin in the village of Astley, you'll certainly understand why.
George Eliot's first success as a storyteller came with the publication of her Scenes of Clerical Life in Blackwood's magazine. And this church appears as Nebley Church and is actually where her parents were married. The reviews were excellent when her Scenes of Clerical Life were published in book form, and encouraged, she began work on Adam Bede, which received even greater acclaim. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were said to have enjoyed the novel greatly, adding to George Eliot's growing popularity. However, drawing on childhood memories like this beautiful church, there was one person who was quick to identify George Eliot, and that was, of course, Marian's brother, Isaac. The Evans family was scandalised by Marian's relationship with George Lewis and shunned her completely, making it impossible for her to even visit the places that had now made her so famous. Yet for the world of literature, this was one cloud that very definitely had a silver lining, and as we return to Charlcote Mill, all will be revealed.
Without a doubt, the most influential person in Marian's childhood had been her brother Isaac, and with her identity no longer a secret, in her next novel, The Mill on the Floss, she was now free to write about this complex relationship. The hugely autobiographical work was another success, critically and financially, and Mr. and Mrs. Lewis moved up in the world. In London, they were no longer social outcasts, and Marian moved into a new phase of her writing career. It was as if she had exorcised her demons, and when Silas Marner was published in 1861, her readers discovered a much gentler side to George Eliot, when the miserly weaver of Raveloe discovers that love is far greater than riches when it comes to finding happiness.
Despite a brief defection to a new publisher with the unsuccessful Romola, a historic tale of Italy which Blackwood had felt would not be well received, George Eliot returned to Matters English and the astute Blackwood with the novel Felix Holt in 1830. Even so, it failed to capture the public imagination, but her next work, Middlemarch, published in 1871, proved to be George Eliot's masterpiece. Her readers were mesmerised by the goings-on in the town being transformed by the Industrial Revolution, based on the author's memories of Coventry, and they eagerly waited for her next novel, her last, Daniel Deronda, in 1876. It was a brave work, discrediting anti-Semitism, but was not as popular with the Victorians as Middlemarch had been. But as memories of her Warwickshire past still coloured George Eliot's literary offerings, London life for Marian, in the grand Regent's Park house she now shared with her beloved Lewis, suddenly changed dramatically. In 1878, George Lewis developed cancer and died on the 30th of November at the age of 61. Marian was devastated, and when he was buried in Highgate Cemetery, she was too overcome with grief to attend his funeral. Nevertheless, as she recovered, she started to become close to her financial advisor, John Cross, who she and Lewis had always referred to as Nephew Johnny. He was 20 years her junior, but evidently saw something that appealed to him in the 60-year-old author, because they were married in 1880, and in December moved into the very stylish 4 Cheyne Walk in Chelsea. We do have one clue, however, to the mysterious allure of George Eliot, as after the young American writer Henry James had met her, he described her in a way that she may not altogether have seen as a compliment. To begin with, she is magnificently ugly, deliciously hideous. She has a low forehead, dull grey eye, vast pendulous nose, and a mouth full of uneven teeth. Now, in this vast ugliness, there is a powerful beauty, so that you end as I ended, falling in love with this great horse-faced blue-stocking. Sadly, though, the new and now respectfully married Mrs. Cross was not destined to find happiness with her new husband at Cheyne Walk, falling ill with laryngitis soon after moving in, and her condition deteriorated rapidly. She died very suddenly on the 22nd of December 1880, with John Cross at her side. Although he tried to have his famous wife buried in Westminster Abbey's Poets' Corner, the religious establishment turned the mortal remains of George Eliot away because of her relationship with George Lewis. and she was instead buried next to the man she had considered her husband, even though the church did not for so many years, in Highgate Cemetery. Ironically, one of the mourners at her funeral was none other than Isaac Evans, who had become reconciled with his sister after her marriage to John Cross. And it's sad that George Eliot did not live long enough to return home to Warwickshire to revisit the places that inspired her to become one of literature's greatest novelists.
But it's not in London that we should bid farewell to this extraordinary woman who was so far ahead of her time. The only proper place we should take our leave is back once more in the heart of George Eliot country, as she said herself in Middlemarch.
Little details gave each field a particular physiognomy, dear to the eyes that have looked on them from childhood.
Proving beyond all doubt that despite so often being mistaken for a man, George Eliot was indeed a woman of vision, sustained her whole life long by memories of this remarkable landscape.
There's something truly remarkable about the British rural landscape, and if you turn to the pages of classic literature, you'll find many examples that prove this to be the case. Whether Jane Austen's Hampshire, Charles Dickens's Kent, the Bronte sisters' Yorkshire, Thomas Hardy's Wessex, or George Eliot's Warwickshire, the great British countryside plays a starring role. I'm Liam Dale, and if you'd like to see for yourself, join me as I reveal the Nottinghamshire of D.H.LAWRENCE.
For most people, just the mention of D.H. Lawrence carries with it a whiff of scandal, especially if his infamous novel Lady Chatterley's Lover is part of the conversation. But this truly great British author, who was never fully appreciated in his own lifetime, wrote about a landscape that he described as the country of his heart, and it all started here in Eastwood, on the outskirts of Nottingham. This is the D.H. Lawrence Birthplace Museum at 8A Victoria Street, and it's been carefully restored and refurbished to reflect the age into which our author was born. Today, it certainly has a Victorian charm, but realistically, when David Herbert Richards Lawrence was born in the front bedroom on the 11th of September 1885, life in this miner's terrace was anything but rural and far from idyllic.
As childhoods go, young Bert Lawrence, as he was always known, had a pretty tough time. His mother Lydia considered herself a lady and had married his father Arthur, a gregarious but poor miner, to escape her family's genteel poverty, believing him to be much better off than he was. By the time she realised the truth, it was too late, and the mismatched couple fought bitterly and would provide the inspiration for the warring morals in Lawrence's autobiographical Sons and Lovers.
Arthur Lawrence worked here at Brinsley Pit, spending his life underground, along with the majority of the men in the district. They had to be tough to survive, and for the refined Lydia, his rough manners and tendency to spend his few hours above ground and his wages in the pub caused violent rows. Bert was their fourth child, arriving after George, Ernest and Emily, and was quickly followed by another daughter, Ada. All of the children took their mother's side, turning against their father, and when Lawrence remembered Arthur in later life, his words were chilling.
I was born hating my father as early as ever I can remember. I shivered with horror when he touched me.
It's hard to imagine what it must have been like living in this tiny house with 4 children plus another on the way, and 2 adults who were constantly fighting. Eventually, a move was inevitable, but it was to an area known as the Breach, renamed as the Bottoms in Sons and Lovers. Although Garden Road today looks perfectly pleasant, when the Lawrences moved here in 1887, the kitchen opened onto a back alley where the dust and stench from the ash pits pervaded the air.
By this stage, Lydia knew there was no escaping the hard life she had married into, but there was a chance for her children, and she was intelligent enough to realise that for her boys to avoid going down the pit, they needed an education. At the age of 3, young Bert Lawrence joined his older brothers at Beauvale School, Greasley, and it was far from being a happy experience. Always a sickly child, he was too frail to take part in games, and often stayed at home with his mother, which resulted in him being teased and bullied. But Bert was a clever boy, and when he was 12 and a half, he won a scholarship to Nottingham High School. The council was sponsoring poorer children, covering part of the cost, but Lydia still had to find the money to make up the difference. Even so, she must have been delighted at her son's success, although the stigma of being a scholarship boy resulted in him being shunned by his classmates. Lawrence's sense of not belonging was heightened. Like his mother, he'd been educated above the community he lived in, while that very background prevented him from being accepted in the middle-class environment of the high school. To begin with, though, the boy from the Breach did well, even winning prizes. But when a family scandal hit the headlines, Bert's schoolwork went into a sudden decline. Arthur Lawrence's brother, Walter, had been tried for killing his 15-year-old son in a drunken accident, and the newspapers exposed the whole sordid story. It marked the end of Lawrence's time at the high school, as he left that summer and never returned. While Bert had been struggling at school, his older brother Ernest had been bringing a good wage home to his mother, and he'd become the apple of her eye. Ernest was employed in an office, thanks to his clerical skills, earning him not only a good living, but also a rise to the middle classes, and Lydia's prayers for a better life for her children had been answered.
Lydia must have been overjoyed when, some years later, Ernest got a position in a London solicitor's office, and when he returned to visit, in his top hat, frock coat and kid gloves, he was every bit the gentleman. However, tragedy struck when Ernest went back to London, as he fell ill with an inflammatory disease and died. Lydia rushed to his bedside, but it was too late. All she could do was bring her beloved son's body back to Eastwood for burial.
For Lawrence, the loss of his brother, coupled with his mother's overwhelming grief, made this a very dark chapter in his life, and he took a job in a factory to help with the household income. family had long since moved from the Breach to Walker Street, and it was here that the troubled young man fell gravely ill. In her pleasant bay-windowed home, Lydia was suddenly jolted out of her grief for Ernest by her concern for Bert, and she nursed him so attentively that the bond between them became almost oppressive. In fact, in later years, Lawrence acknowledged that his relationship with his mother was beyond the normal boundaries for parent and child. "We have been like one, so sensitive to each other that we never needed words. It has been rather terrible and has made me, in some respects, abnormal." As Lawrence convalesced, he discovered something truly wonderful. Just a short distance from the coal dust-covered confines of Eastwood lay the beautiful Nottinghamshire countryside, and a new chapter opened in the life of D.H. Lawrence. Lydia set great store by religion and attended the nearby Congregational Chapel, and it was here that she met Anne Chambers. So when her new friend moved to Hag's Farm near Underwood, the Lawrences were invited for a visit.
The impression the countryside made on Lawrence was phenomenal, and that first walk he took from his home to Hag's Farm with his mother has been immortalised in Sons and Lovers.
The mother and son went through the wheat and oats over a little bridge into a wild meadow. Peeweets with their white breasts glistening wheeled and screamed about them. The lake was still and blue. High overhead, a heron floated. Opposite, the wood heaped on the hill, green and still. But it wasn't just the landscape that appealed to Lawrence. The boisterous Chambers family took him to their hearts. He became firm friends with the Chambers brothers and developed a relationship with their sister Jessie that would inspire him to create the character of Miriam Levers in Sons and Lovers. Although at first their friendship was perfectly acceptable, by the time Lawrence was 20, his family gave him an ultimatum: either become engaged to Jessie or leave her alone. With his whole life ahead of him, and knowing he was not in love with Jessie, he decided upon the latter option. But Jessie was terribly upset when he told her of his decision, as she had fallen head over heels in love with Lawrence. Leaving Jessie and Hag's Farm behind him, Lawrence again tried to make his way in education, winning a place at Nottingham University College, studying to become a teacher. When he arrived, he was full of hope and great expectations, and in his novel, The Rainbow, his heroine, Ursula Brangwen's first impressions of attending university were without doubt his own. The big college, built of stone, standing in the quiet street, with a rim of grass and lime trees, all so peaceful. She felt it remote, a magic land. But the magic soon wore off, and the university was subject to an angry attack by Lawrence with these words: "Spurious Gothic arches, spurious peace, spurious Latinity, spurious dignity of France, spurious naivety of Chaucer."
Yet his memories of this beautiful countryside were never far from his thoughts, and although Lawrence was prone to bouts of sudden fierce anger, while studying in Nottingham, he discovered a way to channel his furious energy. But if you want to know what he did to dampen the burning flames of rage, you'll have to join me again in just a few moments. While the other students scribbled their notes during lectures, Lawrence allowed his mind to drift back here as he started writing his first novel, The White Peacock. It recreated the golden days at Hag's Farm, and although he wasn't allowed to see Jessie Chambers alone, he did get the pages of his manuscript to her, and her comments proved invaluable.
Despite Lawrence's disappointment with his university experience, he did very well indeed, and when his studies were complete, he found a position as an assistant schoolmaster in London.
It was an incredible achievement for the miner's son born here in Eastwood, but as Lawrence battled to tame his students, who he described as wild beasts in the daytime, it was memories of Nottinghamshire he returned to in the evening as he worked on The White Peacock. At a distance, Jessie remained a faithful friend to Lawrence, offering encouragement, and she would prove to be instrumental in promoting his literary career.
As Lawrence settled to city life, visiting theatres, museums, and soaking up the cultural atmosphere, the novelist and editor Ford Madox Ford had founded a journal called The English Review. The works of such luminaries as Thomas Hardy and H.G. Wells had been published in the review, and when Jessie sent some of Lawrence's poems to Ford, he was keen to meet the budding author. Not only did Lawrence get his poems published, but also Ford believed the young man had genius and suggested he send The White Peacock to Heinemann. When the publisher accepted the manuscript immediately, paying the not inconsiderable sum of £50, Lawrence was set fair for a glittering literary career.
Undoubtedly, Jessie Chambers and the whole Hag's Farm experience had been key to this early success, and when he returned to Nottinghamshire for visits, the pair became closer, and Lawrence sought a physical relationship with the girl he'd not been prepared to marry. It proved to be disastrous for both of them, and a few months later, Lawrence finished the affair.
However, events at home were about to overshadow any discomfort Lawrence might have felt about Jessie, because just 2 weeks after the breakup, Lydia Lawrence was diagnosed with cancer. The family were, by this time, living in Lincroft, just around the corner from the house in Walker Street, and Lawrence was given permission to leave his teaching post in London to go home and care for his mother. These were desperate days for Lawrence, but he found comfort in the arms of an old friend from teacher training days, Louis Burrows, who came from the lovely village of Costel.
Louis's family home was Church Cottage, next to the lovely church, and at this terrible time for Lawrence, the place must have had quite an impact on our author. It would play a huge part in perhaps his greatest novel, The Rainbow, but for the time being, all his thoughts were focused on Lydia. In fact, although Lawrence proposed to Louis and she accepted him, he never told his mother of the engagement, fearing that it would upset her.
But within days of the proposal, Lydia died and was buried with her son Ernest in Eastwood Cemetery. It was December 1910, and as the year came to an end, Lawrence returned to his post in London, and as he continued to teach, he poured his troubled thoughts into his autobiographical Sons and Lovers. Isolated and depressed, Lawrence had serious doubts about his engagement to Louis, but at that time fell ill with pneumonia. The illness meant the end of Lawrence's teaching career, and when he recovered, he called off the wedding.
As we return to the house Lawrence drew so much inspiration from for Sons and Lovers, we enter another key period in our author's life. His first draft of the novel was never completed, no doubt due to his mother's death. But after giving up teaching, he resumed work on the novel, as events led Lawrence in a very different direction.
Lawrence had always been keen to travel, and as he had German cousins, a plan was proposed for him to go and visit them. Remembering his old German professor, Ernest Weekly, Lawrence decided to go to Nottingham to ask his advice. When Lawrence arrived, Weekly was not at home, but his wife Frida was happy to entertain her husband's guest. There was an instant connection between the unlikely pair, and within minutes they were deep in conversation. Frida was German by birth, totally uninhibited, and Lawrence was instantly captivated.
Frida quickly became the love of Lawrence's life as they embarked upon a wild and passionate affair, often meeting in the countryside around Eastwood.
Eventually, they decided to travel to Germany together, and Lawrence was introduced to Frida's family. Her father, a baron and a military gentleman, was horrified and described his daughter's lover as an ill-bred, common, penniless lout. But Frida was besotted and refused to give him up, and weekly was informed by telegram of his wife's affair. While Frida battled for custody of her children, Lawrence was hoping that having Sons and Lovers published would provide him and Frida with an income.
But Lawrence had been very explicit in every respect with his autobiographical writing, and the manuscript was rejected for being too shocking. Nevertheless, he and Frida continued with their great adventure, travelling to Italy, as Lawrence reworked his novel, which was eventually accepted for publication in 1913.
Frida and Lawrence returned to England for his sister Ada's wedding, and in 1914, shortly before the outbreak of World War I, Frida's divorce came through and the couple were married. Some sense of normality had been restored, and Lawrence's literary career was now prospering. But when war was declared within weeks of their marriage, it heralded yet more trouble for the newlyweds. When Lawrence's latest manuscript, The Wedding Ring, was presented, he was asked to submit again in 6 months, when it was believed that the war would be over, but all hopes of the conflict being resolved quickly were soon dashed. This left the Lawrences in fine. They couldn't return to Europe, and anti-German feeling was rising in Britain, and of course Frida was German, and worse still, the cousin of the Red Baron, the German fighter pilot responsible for so many British deaths.
Moving around the country from place to place, struggling to make ends meet, Lawrence remembered the lovely village of Celt as he transformed The Wedding Ring into 2 sequential novels, The Rainbow and Women in Love. In The Rainbow, Celt becomes Kossuth, where his epic family saga of the Brangwens unfurls generation by generation. However, when it was published in 1915, there was a public outcry at the explicit sexual nature of sections of the novel, and it was removed from the shelves under the Obscene Publications Act of 1857.
Lawrence's reputation lay in tatters, but as the new year of 1916 was rung in, the couple were offered a holiday house on the Cornish coast, and for Lawrence it was the perfect place to retreat from the public gaze. By spring, as the colourful flowers started to bloom, the Lawrences had found 2 cottages to rent at Zena, and while preparations were made, they stayed at the village pub, the Tinner's Arms.
When Lawrence was in Zena, he wrote to a friend and he said, "It is all gorse now, flickering with flowers. Then it will be heather, and then hundreds of foxgloves. It is the best place I've been, I think."
But the Lawrences were far from being a typical couple, and the local people did not take to their exotic neighbours. The vicar at Zena so disapproved of the scandalous pair, he made sure the authorities investigated them as spies, which wasn't difficult because of Frida's nationality. Eventually, they were expelled from Cornwall and had no choice but to return to London, where the police continued to hound them. As soon as the war ended in 1918, the Lawrences were able to leave Britain and set off on what our author described as his savage pilgrimage, travelling the world far and wide to find a place to call home.
However, it was this beautiful Nottinghamshire countryside that continued to inspire our author. While in Florence in 1927, he wrote his best-known novel, Lady Chatterley's Lover, which would cause even more controversy than The Rainbow and Women in Love. But Lawrence's health was failing fast. One of his last poems, written about a blue gentian flower, suggests that he knew full well that his days were numbered.
Reach me a gentian, give me a torch. let me guide myself with the blue forked torch of this flower down the darker and darker stairs. D.H. Lawrence died of tuberculosis on March 2nd, 1930, aged 44. This statue, with a blue gentian cut poignantly in his hands, is a fitting memorial and can be found at Nottingham University.
Yet it is the Nottinghamshire countryside that D.H. Lawrence describes so vividly in his novels that best sums up the brilliance of this creative and passionate man who the world simply wasn't ready for when he walked these paths and told his tales so many years ago.
When you look a little more closely at the novels of the wonderful British authors who've done so much to make literature great, you'll find a portrait of rural Britain as vividly drawn as any well-written character. Whether the Kent of Charles Dickens, George Eliot's Warwickshire, D.H. Lawrence's Nottinghamshire, the Bronte sisters' Yorkshire, or Thomas Hardy's Wessex, there are so many wonderful places to explore. And Jane Austen's Hampshire is no exception, as you're about to discover.
If I tell you that for many people where I'm now standing is considered to be nothing short of hallowed ground, you might think I've just spent a few hours in the pub. Granted, you see before you a classic example of a fine rural landscape, but it is, when all's said and done, a field, albeit a very lovely one. There is, nonetheless, a very good reason for bringing you here, because on this spot, more than 2 centuries ago, a parsonage once stood, where on the 16th of December 1775, a little later than expected, one of the greatest writers of all time was born. The lady in question, for that is undoubtedly the correct way to address her, despite her humble origins, was none other than Jane Austen, the author of Pride and Prejudice, and the creator of literature's favourite couple, the dashingly handsome Mr. Darcy and the truly delectable Elizabeth Bennet. Although there's not a lot to see in Home Meadow, as the field is now known, with the old rectory having been demolished in the 1820s, inside this clump of stinging nettles, you can still find the remnants of the well and old pump that would have served the washhouse in Jane Austen's time. Also, the slope here, we have it on good authority, was one Jane used to enjoy rolling down as a child. And in case you're wondering just who that authority might have been, it's none other than the great lady herself, having written about Catherine Morland, a charmingly spirited heroine from Northanger Abbey, doing the exact same thing. You can relax though, you're not going to be subjected to a visual demonstration. I shall have a roll later when everyone else has left. But I would just like to point out this stunning lime tree, which was planted in 1813 by Jane's older brother, James. But before we make the acquaintance of the rest of the Austen family, we'll take a stroll along the lane to find the delightful church of St. Nicholas, which is such an integral part of the Jane Austen story. From the moment you arrive at the church, you can't fail to notice Miss Austen's presence, because it was here that her father, the Reverend George Austen, served as rector throughout her childhood and youthful years. In fact, Jane's brothers James and Henry were subsequent rectors of Steventon, as was her nephew William Knight, resulting in a family tradition that spanned an incredible, uninterrupted 114 years.
The Reverend George Austen was a scholarly man who'd been proctor of St John's College, Oxford, who, described as handsome, made an advantageous marriage to Cassandra Lee, the niece of the master of Balliol College. So, if you've ever asked yourself why there are so many clergymen in Jane Austen's novels, you now have the answer, because, as you see, the church was the very foundation of the world in which she lived. By the time the Reverend George moved to Steventon Rectory, he and his wife already had 3 sons, James, George and Edward, and once here they were quickly followed by Henry, and then the first Austen girl, Jane's beloved sister, Cassandra. Brother Frank arrived before Jane's birth in 1775, and last but not least came Brother Charles to complete the family.
Quite a brood, all in all. And when you consider that the Reverend Austen also took in students who lived with the family, they must have, on occasion, have filled this lovely little church.
Even in her youth, living here at Steventon, Jane started to write. By the age of 15, when she penned A History of England by a partial, prejudiced and ignorant historian, she was already extremely well read, especially when it came to novels. Also, as Jane grew into a fine-looking young lady, she, along with her sister Cassandra, had certainly attracted the attention of the young men in the district, if the words of their cousin Eliza are to be believed, when she described them as 2 of the prettiest girls in England. It was at this time that Jane started to experiment with novel writing, and her experiences at assemblies and balls held locally, along with social events when visiting relations, all helped to provide the blossoming author with a wealth of romantic material. In 1795, Jane actually attempted a novel of her own, Eleanor and Marianne. And if the names sound familiar, it's because they would evolve to become the Dashwood sisters of Sense and Sensibility fame. A year later, she wrote First Impressions, which so impressed the Reverend George Austen, he sent his daughter's handiwork to a publisher. Sadly, his enthusiasm was not shared by the recipient, who turned it down flat, but as it would reappear as Pride and Prejudice some years later, such fatherly approval was certainly justified. Another early work that would also be retitled was Susan, written in 1798, and this version of what would later become Northanger Abbey focused on a young country girl's introduction to the fashionable society of Bath. This beautiful city, often associated with Jane Austen, provided much inspiration. However, it can come as something of a surprise to discover that Jane actually disliked Bath, although in fairness, this was not altogether the fault of the city. When the Reverend Austen relinquished his duties at Steventon, he chose to retire to Bath, 4 Sydney Place to be precise, and without the financial independence of the Austen boys, Jane and Cassandra had no choice but to leave their beloved Hampshire and exchange their country views for city life. All Jane's progress as an author seemed to come to an abrupt halt, Work on a novel called The Watsons was abandoned, and despite selling the manuscript of Susan for £10, it never appeared in print. The financial constraints on the Austens made life harder than it had ever been at Steventon, and without the advantage of homegrown produce and livestock, these were far from happy times, and matters very suddenly went from bad to worse. When the Reverend George Austen died in January 1805 of an illness he appeared to be recovering from, Bath was forever associated with unhappiness for Jane, and as the Austen ladies were left almost destitute, the future looked decidedly bleak. But during her Bath years, Jane did enjoy one great advantage. Because summers in the city were hot and stuffy, there would be seaside visits that provided her with experiences she would never forget, and thanks to her wonderful writing, they are experiences we can all share.
I'm here at Lyme Regis, walking on the Cobb, immortalised by Jane in her final novel, Persuasion, where her deliciously drawn character, Louisa Musgrove, takes a near-fatal tumble. Actually, Jane Austen devotees will tell you that this is the most exciting attribute of this particular lady, and it is without doubt only because of this remarkable place that she's so often remembered. Even the great Victorian romantic poet Alfred Lord Tennyson, when visiting Lyme, cried out at his guide, "Don't talk to me of the Duke of Monmouth, show me the steps from which Louisa Musgrove fell," proving beyond all doubt just how evocative Jane Austen's description of the event truly was. There was too much wind to make the high part of the new Cobb pleasant for the ladies, and they agreed to get down the steps to the lower, and all were contented to pass quietly and carefully down the steep flight, excepting Louisa. She must be jumped down them by Captain Wentworth. And of course, we all know exactly what is about to happen, and we are not disappointed. She fell on the pavement on the lower Cobb, and was taken up lifeless. There was no wound, no blood, no visible bruise, but her eyes were closed. She breathed not. Her face was like death. The horror of that moment to all who stood around. And if you want to know what happens next to poor headstrong Louisa, you'll have to join me again in just a few moments. Welcome back. The news I can report for Louisa Musgrove is good. The rival for the heart and hand of Captain Wentworth, the true love of Persuasion's timid heroine Anne Eliot, Louisa, is granted her survival. But in classic Austen style, she learns the error of her wild ways, leaves Captain Wentworth to the deserving Anne, and becomes engaged to a fine fellow, more suited to her reformed character.
But what, I hear you ask, of Jane? Well, we know that things must have started to look up for the destitute Austen ladies. After all, there are 6 fabulous novels, still in print to this day. And if you'd like to discover where they were written, we need to return to Hampshire and the picturesque village of Chawton.
When you arrive at Chawton, you'll be left in no doubt as to who once lived here, and there's no better place for us to begin than at Jane Austen House.
Now, as much a living memorial to the lady in question as it is a museum, Jane moved into Chawton Cottage in 1809, and in this letter to her brother Frank expresses perfectly her hopes and her fears.
As for ourselves, we're very well, as unaffected prose will tell. Our Chawton home, how much we find already in it to our mind, and how convinced that when complete, it will all other houses beat.
This improvement in fortunes for Jane came as a direct result of her brother Edward's rise to prominence as a wealthy gentleman. Having been adopted as the heir of Thomas Knight, Edward had a number of estates at his disposal, one of which was Chawton, and while he could have occupied the nearby Great House, he was able to provide Chawton Cottage for his mother and sisters. Today, you'll find many of Jane's personal items here at Chawton. A lock of her hair, still with a glimmer of auburn. The topaz crosses given by brother Charles to Jane and Cassandra. And even the bookcase that belonged to the Reverend George Austen, previously having graced the old rectory at Steventon. But pride of place quite rightly goes to Jane's elegant little writing table, where all of her novels were either revised or written. Here, at the heart of a charming domestic scene, Jane composed her famous tales of love, marriage, wealth and power, while her mother happily tended the garden and Cassandra sat at her sewing or drawing. All of Jane's works were published anonymously during her lifetime, and only her closest family and friends knew of her success. In fact, visitors who come here or want to see, and for that matter hear, the creaking door that warned Jane of imminent interruptions, and she'd be able to hide her writing away so that nobody would ever guess her secret. Looking around this delightful garden, it's evident that Jane Austen, with her love of the rural landscape, would have been much happier here than in the middle of a big city, no matter how elegant it might have been. By the time Jane reached Chawton, she would also have been all too aware that her chances of marrying and having a family of her own were now gone, which would have made attending all the society balls and assemblies that would once have entertained her all the harder to bear. In no time at all, accepting her lot in life, Jane set to work, transforming Elinor and Marianne into Sense and Sensibility, turning to her memories of the Devon coast as a setting for her tale. Published in 1811, this work by A Lady was a success, and she followed it in 1813 with Pride and Prejudice, perhaps her finest work. Bright, light, sparkling and full of wit and wisdom, the opening lines serve notice that this is an author with a story worth the telling.
It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be, on his first entering a neighbourhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of someone or other of their daughters.
Later, when Jane was asked for advice on novel writing by her niece Anna, she explained that 3 or 4 families in a country village is the very thing to work on. And with the phenomenal success of Pride and Prejudice that does this very thing, it was evidently advice that was well worth taking. And you only have to take a walk around Chawton, wander amongst the graves at the churchyard where both Mrs. Austen and Cassandra's can be found, to see where so much of her inspiration came from, building on her earlier experiences at Steventon, when the ideas for both Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice had first taken shape. Following the same formula, next came Mansfield Park, Emma and Persuasion, but with heroines as diverse as anyone could ask, from the terribly wholesome and good Fanny Price to the meddlesome, opinionated Emma Woodhouse and the shy Anne Eliot, who we've already met. And all the while, the beautiful English countryside and ever-changing rural landscape continued to provide the perfect backdrop for Jane's alluring ladies and handsome gentlemen. But if you've been quickly totting that lot up and wondering what happened to the 6th novel, ironically, it's Northanger Abbey. Published posthumously with Persuasion, this was the retitled Susan, which had been wrestled back from the tardy publisher who'd bought it for £10, the first piece of writing Jane Austen ever sold. But there was to be no happy ending for Jane, no Mr. Darcy or Captain Wentworth to whisk her away when all hope of romance was gone. Jane fell ill while working on Persuasion, and although it's now believed she was probably suffering from Addison's disease, there was nothing known of the condition or how to treat it back in the early 1800s.
From struggling to walk and even ride in the donkey carriage that's been so lovingly restored here at Chawton, Jane was taken to Winchester for the best medical care available. In these lodgings, caressed by the shadow of the cathedral, Cassandra nursed her sister until on the 18th of July 1817, at the age of 41, Jane died in Cassandra's arms.
I have lost a treasure, such a sister, such a friend as never can be surpassed. She was the sun of my life, the gilder of every pleasure, the soother of every sorrow.
This was a fine epitaph from Cassandra, and if you walk the short distance from College Street to the cathedral and step inside, you'll find the simple memorial stone, a slab on the floor of the north aisle of the nave where our First Lady of Literature was finally laid to rest. But to complete our literary journey through Jane Austen country, we'll return to the cherished home of our authoress and let her words speak out for themselves one more time.
I can't believe my good fortune. I've actually been allowed to sit here at Jane's writing table, and I have in my hands her very own first edition of Sense and Sensibility. Wonderful. Can you imagine the parcel arriving, all wrapped up in brown paper and string, and Jane opening it with trembling fingers, seeing her words at last in print? Magic moment. I've chosen my favourite extract to finish with, naturally, out in the countryside, when a pleasant stroll has gone horribly wrong. Poor Marianne Dashwood has stumbled on the hillside, and out of the mist and rain, a hero comes to her rescue. I do hope that Jane would have approved of my choice. A gentleman carrying a gun with 2 pointers playing round him was passing up the hill and within a few yards of Marianne when her accident happened. He put down his gun and ran to her assistance. She had raised herself from the ground, but her foot had been twisted in the fall and she was scarcely able to stand. The gentleman offered his services, and perceiving that her modesty declined what her situation rendered necessary, took her up in his arms without further delay and carried her down the hill.
I do hope you've enjoyed this journey through Jane Austen's Hampshire. I never tire of visiting this beautiful countryside. But if you'd like to continue this exploration of rural Britain, join me next time when we'll be be discovering another of the nation's finest landscapes, responsible for inspiring more of literature's best-loved classics. To travel around Britain in search of the rural landscapes that have inspired great writers to put quill to parchment will reveal some truly beautiful locations. From Thomas Hardy's Wessex to Jane Austen's Hampshire, George Eliot's Warwickshire, the Bronte Sisters' Yorkshire, and D.H.LAWRENCE's Nottinghamshire. My name is Liam Dale, and I'd be delighted to escort you back in time in this programme to follow in the footsteps of Charles Dickens, one of literature's most esteemed heroes.
Welcome to Gad's Hill Place, the much-loved home of Charles Dickens, the house that as an impressionable child he'd vowed to own one day. This truly is a rags-to-riches tale to rival anything the great man ever penned. And although it may seem rather strange to begin our journey where Charles Dickens died, rather than where he was born, Gad's Hill played such a significant role in our author's story, which makes it a great place to start.
The setting is beautiful. The Kent countryside at its magnificent best, close to the historic town of Rochester. It was a landscape that would influence Charles Dickens his whole life long, and he spent much of his childhood in this district, while his father John was employed as a clerk in the Navy Pay Office based at Chatham, one of the neighbouring Medway towns of southeast England. And it was while out walking with his father as a child that Charles Dickens first encountered Gad's Hill Place. John Dickens, as you'll discover a little later, may not have been the ideal father, but he did tell his young son, as they stood gazing upon this magnificent house, that if he worked really hard and never lost sight of his dream, Gad's Hill Place could become his home. In fact, the reason why we are so sure that this incident really did take place is because it was a story that Charles Dickens often recounted, and it actually found its way into print many years later in The Uncommercial Traveller, where you'll find these familiar words. Ever since I can recollect, my father, seeing me so fond of it, has often said to me, if you were to be very persevering and were to work hard, you might someday come to live in it. It's not difficult to appreciate how this charming piece of fatherly advice motivated Charles Dickens when he began to make his way in the world. But we are rather racing ahead of ourselves, because it would be many years before John Dickens' prophecy was fulfilled, and to find out how it happened, we need to head for Portsmouth. Charles John Huffam Dickens was born in this modest Portsmouth house to John and Elizabeth Dickens on the 7th of February 1812. Now the Charles Dickens Birthplace Museum, and visitors can see where our author made his first rather humble appearance.
Moving on 5 years, and we've come to Chatham, 11 Ordnance Terrace to be precise. Although when John Dickens and family moved here in 1817, it was actually number 2. From Portsmouth, John Dickens had been posted to London, where, on a reduced income, his debts had started to mount up. But it was a brief stay, and by the time the family arrived here at Chatham, Charles had 2 sisters, one older and one younger, but a baby brother had died in infancy.
Although the location is far from being rural Britain at its beautiful best, when Charles Dickens lived here, there was a hayfield where the railway station stands today. As a child, he spent hours out playing, and many of the individuals he encountered, even at this early age, made a lasting impression on his blossoming imagination. His childhood friend, George Strauchill, who lived at No. 1 Ordnance Terrace, emerged as the charismatic Steerforth in David Copperfield, while the Dickens family's faithful servant, Mary Weller, was immortalised as the redoubtable Clara Peggotty in the same autobiographical work. As a small boy, Charles had no idea of the debts his father had been running up, something he would do his whole life long, constantly living beyond his means. Nevertheless, the family grew in size, and inevitably, with hungry mouths to feed, it was necessary to move to more modest lodgings in Chatham. It would have been during this period in Charles Dickens's life that a walk to Higham, past Gad's Hill Place, resulted in John Dickens inspiring his son to make his mark on the world. And Gad's Hill was far from being the only place that captured the impressionable child's imagination. The lovely village of Cobham, where the Leather Bottle pub, as popular today with Dickens enthusiasts as it was when our author was alive, is typical of this part of Kent. But there's one delightful church in the charming village of Cooling that is visited by those on the Charles Dickens trail even more often than the Leather Bottle.
This is the church of St James at Cooling, and a walk through this graveyard will reveal a remarkable treasure for anyone interested in the works of Charles Dickens. Thought to have been the inspiration for the sinister place where young Pip encounters the malevolent convict Magwitch in Great Expectations, the opening lines of this dramatic novel leave us in no doubt whatsoever that it's the same atmospheric location that Charles Dickens was remembering. Ours was the marsh country, down by the river, within, as the river wound, 20 miles of the sea. My first most vivid and broad impression of the identity of things seems to me to have been gained on a memorable raw afternoon towards evening. At such a time, I found out for certain that this bleak place, overgrown with nettles, was the churchyard, and that Philip Pirrip, late of this parish, and also Georgiana, wife of the above, were dead and buried, and that Alexander, Bartholomew, Abraham, Tobias and Roger, infant children of the aforesaid, were also dead and buried, and that the dark, flat wilderness beyond the churchyard, intersected with dykes and mounds and gates, with scattered cattle feeding on it, was the marshes. Dickens only talks of 5 tragic little graves in his novel, but there are 13 tiny tombs here at Cooling, and as the church is no longer in use, you certainly get a sense of a truly eerie landscape. Nevertheless, if you ask a cross-section of people to define what makes a classically Dickensian scene, it'll often include snow, an old coaching inn, and the timbered high street of a country town. And we don't have to travel far to find the very place that was such a favourite with Charles Dickens from his earliest childhood memories right through to his dying day. This is Rochester, and for anyone hoping to catch a glimpse of Charles Dickens's ghost, I have been reliably informed that this is definitely the place to come. Either side of me, if evidence is required, you can see just how historically important Rochester is, boasting perhaps the best preserved castle in England and a cathedral that happens to be one of the nation's oldest.
Now, fascinating as the beautiful ancient architecture might be, If you're still looking for that classic Dickensian scene, you need go no further than Rochester's long straggling High Street, as it was described by the man himself in Sketches by Boz, way back in 1836.
It's no wonder that the very young, impressionable and very imaginative Charles Dickens was captivated by this colourful street. Standing here today, I'm equally enthralled by this unique place. The idea of a coach and horses pulling in here to the Royal Victoria and Bull Hotel, carrying Mr. Pickwick and his friends, is as delightful as ever, and a blanket of crisp white snow would complete the picture to perfection.
Mr. Winkle, who sits at the extreme edge, with one leg dangling in the air, is nearly precipitated into the street as the coach twists round the sharp corner by the cheesemonger's shop and turns into the marketplace. And before Mr. Snodgrass, who sits next to him, has recovered from his alarm, they pull up at the inn yard where the fresh horses with cloths on are already waiting. The coachman throws down the reins and gets down himself, and the other outside passengers drop down also, except those who have no great confidence in their ability to get up again, and they remain where they are and stamp their feet against the coach to warm them, looking with longing eyes and red noses at the bright fire in the inn bar and the sprigs of holly with red berries which ornament the window. Again, I think we all now know exactly where the inspiration for this extract from the Pickwick Papers came from. But if you'd like to discover the reason for Charles Dickens's preoccupation with snow at Christmas time, join me again in just a few moments.
There's no chance of snow today, but if you come to Rochester for the annual Dickensian Christmas Festival, you're guaranteed snow, even if it does have to be of the artificial variety. But it's definitely memories of childhood that set the older Dickens writing about the pleasures of seasonal weather, because for the first 8 years of his life, it snowed every Christmas. But not all of Dickens's childhood memories were quite so happy. And in 1822, when he moved with his family back to London, the dark, dismal world that young Charles entered was as far removed from beautiful rural Kent as could possibly be imagined.
Right from John Dickens's arrival in London, the financial troubles that had beset him for so many years got progressively worse, and any hopes young Charles had of receiving an education were dashed, not least because, as the oldest boy, he'd already been put to work in Warren's Blacking, a boot polish factory run by a relation of his mother. Then, to complete the humiliation of the sensitive child, John Dickens was arrested for debt and thrown into the Marshalsea prison, and the rest of the family joined him there, apart from Charles, who was left to work 10 hours a day in the factory. Eventually, an inheritance from a distant relation secured the Dickens family release, but Charles never forgave his mother for forcing him to continue at the blacking factory, although in the end, his father's determination that his son should go to school won the day, and for 2 years, while in his early teens, Charles attended the Wellington House Academy, which seems quite remarkable when you return to Gad's Hill Place.
It's hard to believe as I sit here in the grand house where Dickens penned such classics as A Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations, that such a brief education, coupled with a little schooling at Chatham courtesy of a neighbour, was enough to set Charles on his way. Taking a junior position with London law firm Ellis and Blakemore, Dickens worked hard to rise above the impecunious habits of his father, and even taught himself shorthand, enabling him to become a parliamentary journalist reporting on the proceedings in the House of Commons.
The law became a great fascination for Dickens, the plight of the poor who'd fallen foul of the British judiciary system even more so, and would soon become a major source of inspiration as he started to write short stories under the pen name Boz, alongside his journalistic endeavours. Things began to look up as the blossoming young writer, now in his early 20s, was able to take rooms at Furnival's Inn to become a gentleman about town. And after being commissioned to write short stories by George Hogarth, editor of the Evening Chronicle, his sketches by Boz were quickly followed by the first instalment of the Pickwick Papers. And you don't need me to tell you how successful Mr. Pickwick and his colourful assortment of friends proved to be from their earliest appearance. Charles Dickens was fast becoming a phenomenon, and with his unexpected rise to prominence, he married Catherine Hogarth, the daughter of the man who had, in effect, launched his son-in-law's professional writing career. When it came to choosing a honeymoon destination, Charles, as ever, reverted to the Kent of his childhood, and the newlyweds came here to Chalk, one of the loveliest English villages you're ever likely to see. This charming, timber-boarded cottage has a plaque claiming it was the house that Charles and Catherine stayed in, but it's been suggested that the original would have actually stood on the other side of the road. While here, Charles would have been writing further instalments of the Pickwick Papers, and you only have to look at the old forge to see that he was already collecting ideas that would last his entire writing career, as this is where it's believed Dickens found the inspiration for Joe Gargery's blacksmith's forge in Great Expectations. After their honeymoon, Charles and Catherine returned to Furnival's Inn, where they were joined by Catherine's younger sister, Mary. The couple's first son, Charles Jr., was born on the 6th of January 1837, but all was far from well, as Catherine slipped into what we would recognise today as postnatal depression. As Kent evidently had great restorative powers for Charles, Catherine, baby Charles and Mary came back to Chalk, while Charles Sr. commuted between London and his family as he continued to advance his writing career. Then, in April 1837, as a successful author, still only 25 years of age, Charles Dickens secured 48 Doughty Street in the London district of Holborn for his family, and this is the only London house that Dickens lived in that's still standing. Today, it's the Charles Dickens Museum. However, it was here that tragedy struck just weeks after they all moved in, and it would influence Dickens's entire writing career, and very possibly damaged his marriage. On the 7th of May, 1837, 17-year-old Mary Hogarth, Catherine's sister, died in her brother-in-law's arms, and he was inconsolable. She became immortalised as Little Nell in The Old Curiosity Shop. But when Dickens had "Young, Beautiful and Good" inscribed on the unfortunate girl's headstone, who can say what his wife must have thought? As Oliver Twist followed the Pickwick Papers, and a succession of wonderful novels appeared in print, the moment finally came when John Dickens's prophecy that his son might one day live at Gad's Hill Place came true. Charles Dickens, now in his mid-40s, was an international phenomenon. More than 30 years after his father's most astute words were spoken, Dickens' boyhood dream came true. By the time he bought Gad's Hill Place in 1856, he was already arguably the most successful novelist in the English language. And should you be wondering why I've brought you here to a tunnel of all places, there's actually a very good reason. Because it runs under the main road, and Dickens had it built especially for him. Our esteemed author was given a Swiss chalet where he loved to write, and it stood immediately across the road from Gad's Hill Place, which is why Dickens had the tunnel constructed so that he could move between the house and the chalet without ever being noticed. In fact, you can find the Swiss chalet in the gardens of Eastgate House on Rochester High Street, and it does look as if it would have been an idyllic place to write. You may be thinking by now that Charles Dickens was only happy when surrounded by the Kentish landscape of his boyhood, but the east coast of the county pleased him equally well. Broadstairs was a particular favourite, and gazing out to sea was a major source of inspiration for Dickens. He always tried to spend a month here every year, in what was then called Fort House, but is now better known, not surprisingly, as Bleak House. When his travels abroad prevented him from visiting in 1844 and 46, Dickens claimed to be hankering after the good old tarry, salt little pier of Broadstairs, and you can really see why. For Charles Dickens, travel became a regular part of his life, and crossing the Atlantic as he gave reading tours of America meant that he became something of a celebrity.
Finally, it seemed that Charles Dickens had overcome the torment of his youth and the squalor of London to find contentment here in the countryside that he loved so dearly. A social campaigner with a voice that was always listened to. As a writer, he did more than any politician to raise awareness of the plight of the poor, especially the children. But happiness still eluded Charles Dickens. His marriage to Catherine had failed, and in a bitter separation, he sent his wife to live away from him and their children. Although he undoubtedly fell in love with the young actress Ellen Ternan, whatever passed between them was kept secret, and Dickens drove himself relentlessly onwards, writing and giving public readings. By the time Dickens started work on The Mystery of Edwin Drood, it was again Rochester providing him with his inspiration. He talks of the old stone gatehouse crossing the close, with an arched thoroughfare passing beneath it. And you see before you the very gatehouse. Sadly, The Mystery of Edwin Drood was never completed. On a June morning, Charles Dickens stood at these gates, apparently just staring in, before returning home to Gad's Hill Place. This is Restoration House, where Dickens took his inspiration for Miss Havisham's decaying mansion in Great Expectations, and it's impossible not to speculate, frankly, as to whether our author was bidding Rochester a fond farewell, because later the same day he had a stroke from which he never recovered. Charles Dickens died on the 9th of June 1870 at the age of 58, having achieved success beyond even his wildest dreams. Characteristically, he wanted to be buried in Rochester Cathedral, but the nation demanded such a literary great, who they considered to be their own, be laid to rest in Westminster Abbey's Poets' Corner. All we can hope, standing next to this memorial plaque, is that the wonderful words spoken by Sidney Carton to conclude A Tale of Two Cities held true for their creator, Charles Dickens, leaving the man who had loved this part of rural Britain so much to rest in peace. It is a far, far better thing that I do now than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known.
And on that poignant note, all that remains is to thank you for allowing me to be your guide through the evocative Kent countryside that so captivated Charles Dickens, and cordially invite you to join me again next time to visit another of Britain's beautiful landscapes, which inspired the creation of further great works of classic literature.